Okay, welcome everyone who's joined so far. Everyone has automatically been placed on mute until the end of the program when we'll have time to address the questions. If you have questions during the talk, please enter them in the chat and I'll write them down and read them off to Matt at the end of the program. So hopefully we can cover everything. But thank you so much, Matt, for doing this program. And this evening's program is the 15th millionth Ford. On May 26, 1927, Ford Motor Company built its 15th millionth Model T. This special car represented the end of the Model T's remarkable 19-year production run. In this live virtual Zoom event, Matt Anderson explores the ceremony surrounding the car's build, its use as a corporate symbol, and its conservation and exhibition at the Henry Ford. Matt Anderson joined the Henry Ford as Curator of Transportation in 2012. From childhood, he's always been fascinated by anything with wheels or wings. His favorite artifacts include the Wright Cycle Shop, the 1948 Tucker 48 sedan, and like everyone else who's visited the museum, the 1941 Allegheny locomotive. So welcome, Matt. Thanks so much for doing this tonight.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate it. It's nice to be with all of you. And I should say, in addition to working in Dearborn, I also live here in Dearborn. So I'm a regular visitor at the library. Great to help.
Oh, great.
Program. So yeah, but I'm going to share my screen here. I've got some slides and so forth to share with you tonight. So we'll make sure we get that going. Hopefully everybody is seeing the picture of the car right now. But that is our subject for tonight, the 15 millionth Ford. And I guess I should say right from the outset, there is a little confusion about what that means. Is it the 15 millionth Ford going all the way back to the first Ford Motor Company car, which was the Model A, or is it just the 15 millionth Model T? And strictly speaking, it's the 15 millionth Model T, but from 1909 right on up to the end there in May of 1927, Ford didn't really build anything else other than Model Ts. So at the time this car was built, Ford was synonymous with Model T. So they simply called it the 15 millionth Ford, but it is the last of the Model Ts. So definitely a significant car by anyone's estimation. So just to give you a kind of an outline of how we're going to do this tonight, we'll just start briefly talking about the Model T itself, why this car is so significant and had made such a lasting contribution to American mobility. Then we'll talk about building the last T. I've got some great photographs from the ceremonies that surrounded the construction of this last car. We'll talk about conserving the last T, so the work that we've done to kind of care for it and preserve it over the past, well, almost 100 years, not too far away now. And then exhibiting the last T. We'll look at how the car has been used both by Ford Motor Company in special exhibits and then by us at the Henry Ford. And indeed, the car is on display right now. It's not necessarily hidden, but it's maybe not where you might expect to see it. So we'll reveal that as well. But we'll have some time, I think, for questions at the end as well. So I'll be happy to try and answer as many of those as I can. With that said, we'll jump right in and take a look at the original Ford Model T. This is one of the prototype cars. And for those of you who know your Ford Motor Company history, you know that Henry failed twice to establish an automobile company. He had built the quadricycle, his little four-wheel experimental buggy, in 1896 and drove it in Detroit on the early morning hours of June 4th, 1896. But it was purely that, an experimental car. Henry had no intentions of producing the quadricycle and trying to sell it commercially. It was simply too small, too underpowered. All it was a way for him to kind of wrap his mind around what it took to build a functioning gasoline-powered automobile. Having built the quadricycle, he quickly sold it and used the money to build a second car, and then raised enough money, enough investor interest to launch his first automobile company, the Detroit Automobile Company, which failed rather quickly. And the commonly accepted explanation is that the cars they were making just weren't very good, frankly, right? This is not that any cars were all that good when this company was founded at the turn of the 20th century, but this one just wasn't going to do it. So that company failed. That's when Henry got the idea to start racing to kind of restore his reputation, get his name in the newspapers. So He built a couple of race cars, including the Sweepstakes, which he won a race against Alexander Winton at Grosse Pointe in October of 1901, driving that car. He also built the 999, which was probably the better known of the two race cars. That one was driven by a fellow named Barney Oldfield and was one of the first really famous American-built race cars. But then he got some investor interest, started a second company, the Henry Ford Company, and that sadly failed as well. And that was because Henry got a little too caught up in racing, right? He was spending too much time building and working on his racing cars, not an actual commercial production car that they could sell to the public. So Henry and his backers had a parting of the ways. But as I say, the third time was the charm. In June of 1903, Ford rounds up another batch of investors, primarily Alexander Malcolmson, who had been a coal dealer in Detroit, and then some other significant names, folks who would become significant, including John and Horace Dodge, the Dodge brothers, who of course would launch their own car company some years later. But they got together, got enough money, got chartered, and established Ford Motor Company in June of 1903. And that's where Henry finally hits his stride. And their first product, not a terribly imaginative name, but logically enough, they called it the Model A, the original Model A of 1903. And then that was followed by a Model B, a Model C. There was a Model N, which was quite a success, really Ford Motor Company's first big success, best-selling car in the United States in 1906. And then following that, there was an S and an R, or I should say an R and an S to stay in alphabetical order. And then logically enough, followed by the Model T. And the Model T represented Henry's ultimate vision, really from the beginning of his work, commercially building cars. At this time, circa 1900 to 1910, you could buy a good car, you could buy a cheap car, but you couldn't buy a good cheap car, if you understand me. Obviously, well-built cars, cars that lasted, cars that could handle the terrible roads of the time were very expensive, $2,000, $3,000. This at a time when a good salary was maybe $500 a year. So that was obviously an issue. If you could buy a less expensive car, and there were cars available for $300, $400, they tended to be very lightly, cheaply, poorly built, and often would literally shake apart on the terrible roads of the time. So Henry Ford recognized that if he could build a quality automobile and sell it at a reasonable price, the market potential was basically unlimited, right? Theoretically, every adult in the United States might want one of these motor cars. Certainly there was a lot of interest from the time the first cars appeared for sale, even though they were priced really so only the wealthy could enjoy them. Everybody wanted to have one, right? There was this realization that a car provided freedom, right? You could move on your own schedule, go beyond just where the railroad track or the trolley track would take you. You wouldn't be limited by the range of your horse-drawn Surrey. So Henry realized there was a market, and he exploited that. And the work for his car, which realized this dream, the Model T, took place in the second Ford Motor Company plant. The first one was on Mack Avenue, and that's a building we have recreated in Greenfield Village, kind of a scaled down version of the original Mack Avenue plant. They were only there for a year and a half at most, and then they moved to the Paquette Avenue plant, which was in the Milwaukee Junction area of Detroit, not too far from where the DIA is today. And that was really the heart of Detroit's early automotive industry. And the Paquette plant still survives today. In fact, there's a fantastic museum there where you can go and see they've obviously got a number of early Ford automobiles on there on display, but they've also interpreted the spaces. They've kind of recreated Henry Ford's office. They've also recreated the secret room in the corner of Paquette where Henry brought together a hand-selected team of his most trusted aides. He had some engineers, he had the designers, production specialists, his son Edsel, who was quite young at that time, but still was there for some of those meetings. And that is where they planned the Model T. And it had to meet all of those criteria, right? It had to be very well built, it had to be durable, also had to be fairly inexpensive. And they tested this prototype we're looking at in this photo with sort of a shakedown cruise. They drove the car literally around Lake Michigan, starting in Detroit, going up through the Lower Peninsula by ferry into the UP, and then across the length of the Upper Peninsula into Wisconsin, down to Illinois, Indiana, back into Michigan, across the Lower Peninsula, back to Detroit. And the car performed essentially flawlessly on that trip. And this photo was taken not long after it returned, still covered with some of the mud and the grime from that trip. So if a car could make it that far without any issues, Henry was confident that he'd found his design. This was it. And here we're looking at the Model T as probably most of us picture it in our heads. Was introduced in October of 1908 and built continuously right on up through May of 1927, as we're talking about. But this one is from what we would now call the 1914 model year. And there were a number of important things that took place in 1914, which we'll look at. But that was also not incidentally the year in which Henry established his famous "any color you want so long as it's black" policy. Prior to that, you could get the Model T in a number of different colors: red, dark blue, dark green. Later on in its production run, colors came back as well, but for much of the production of the car, it was only available in black. And there are a couple of theories that have popped up over the years as to why this was so. One of the myths is that the black paint dried faster, and that's why Henry went with black in it. Not true. The black didn't dry all that much faster than the dark greens or the dark blues that they were using. The bottom line is just black was inexpensive as colors go, and it was also a color that went with everything, as they say in fashion, right? The black dress or the black suit goes with anything. Well, the black car went with anything. So that's the color that Ford used. And obviously, having just one color, you streamline your production process, you streamline your supply process for that matter, not having to worry about having a supply of different colors on hand. So the black policy served them well for many years. I mentioned important changes that took place in 1914, and certainly probably the most important is the moving assembly line, which Ford first begins to experiment with the year before in 1913. And we should say, by this time, Ford has left the Piquette Avenue plant. The first Model Ts were built at Piquette Avenue, but only for a short period of time. By 1910, the company moves in to the Highland Park plant, farther, I guess we'll say, not north, but I suppose west or northwest on Woodward Avenue, pardon me, in the Highland Park plant. Some of it still stands today. The Ford Administration Building is still there, right on Woodward. You can drive by it and see it there. But the Highland Park plant is where most of the Model Ts were built and where Ford's experiments with the moving assembly line really sort of took off. And they started, just as we're seeing right here, by assembling flywheel magnetos on a moving line. And the magneto is the part that generates electricity for the spark plugs to produce the spark to cause the combustion, of course, that makes the gasoline-fueled engine go. And by building these on a moving assembly line, Ford was kind of shocked, stunned, frankly, at how much more productive his workers were, rather than having one person build a magneto from the ground up, having them put just one piece into that magneto and then slide it onto the next person. And you can see here the initial version of this assembly line is fairly crude, right? It's not driven by any kind of a chain or a conveyor belt. They're just assembling these pieces and sliding them along these guide rails to the next person on the line. You'll also notice that the parts are in bins underneath the workers there, so you don't have to leave. Part of the rationale behind the moving assembly line is that you move the work to the worker. The worker doesn't get up and move to find the tools, to find the parts, to find the piece that they're building. It all comes to them, far more efficient that way. And another big importance of the moving assembly line, or a reason that it was able to kind of take off when it did under Ford's vision, is because we were starting to move away from line shafts. And I mentioned that because you can see in the background these the wheels here and the axles that are all connected to belts. All of these would be connected to a central shaft, which was driven by either a steam machine or an electric generator, perhaps, that was hooked up to the line shafts by this time. And in fact, if you come to Greenfield Village and visit the Armington and Sims shop near the entrance to the village, you can see some of those line shafts in use in Armington and Sims. And it's a great way for transferring power. The problem is you've always got to keep your machinery near that overhead line so you can physically get your power. The advent of electric motors on tools themselves, so each individual tool or machine is powered by electricity, gave people the flexibility to start rearranging the machinery in the plant. You didn't have to put the tools where the power was. You could put the tool where it made the most sense for the workers. So you can start to organize assembly in a logical sequence, which is, again, a part of the importance of the moving assembly line. And we should say, too, that Henry did not invent the moving assembly line. This was something that had been experimented with and used to more or lesser degree by other manufacturers for decades by the time Ford started building automobiles. Interchangeable parts, which are a big part of the moving assembly line, had been used in manufacture of firearms since the early 19th century. Certainly, they've been used in the manufacture of clocks or watches, precision objects like that, where every part has to work just as well as any other. Most famously, Henry was kind of inspired by meat packing plants in Cincinnati and in Chicago. And if you'll forgive the phrase, we might call those disassembly plants, right? A carcass, a cow, a steer, whatever it might be, would come into the plant on one end and be hung up on a chain, and then that chain would carry it through the plant, and you'd have different workers removing different cuts of meat from the animal until by the time it gets to the end of the line, it's a skeleton basically, right? Just an empty skeleton, and then the meat has all been packed away for packing in tins and shipping. So those plants really inspired Ford and got him thinking it's going to be far more efficient if instead of having a team of workers build a car from the ground up, we do it by moving assembly. And it did improve things. I mean, we talked about how the magnetos were improved so quickly. Ford quickly starts moving to building entire engines on a moving assembly line, and he starts building entire chassis. And then by May of 1914, he's building the whole car on the moving assembly line. And they find very early on that using this new technique, under the old method of stationary assembly, it took something like 13, 14 hours for one team to build a single car. With the moving assembly line, you had the car going through the whole line from scrap pieces to finished product in about 90 minutes, so an hour and a half. So tremendous productivity gains. And of course, they kept tinkering and experimenting, refining the line, and improve that time even more. The other interlocked innovation that came at this time was a direct result of the moving assembly line, and that's the $5 day, also introduced in 1914, which is why this is the pivotal year at Ford Motor Company. And the real drawback, certainly from the workers' perspective of the moving assembly line, is that the whole idea behind it is to take the skill out of manufacturing automobiles. Now, under the old stationary assembly system, workers very rightfully considered themselves skilled craftsmen, right? They were doing highly refined, highly technical work that took a lot of training and expertise to master. Well, when you have a moving assembly line, you essentially want to take all of that away from the equation. A worker is just adding one part to the car, turning one screw, attaching one bolt, whatever it might be. And the workers, not surprisingly, were rather disappointed to find that now they'd essentially been kind of downgraded in terms of their skills, and they were just doing this basic work. Not to mention the grind of the moving assembly line. At least when you're building one car from the ground up, you've got some variety in the work you're doing. You're never quite doing the same task again and again, which is exactly what you're doing on the moving assembly line. And suffice it to say that that chain or the belt, whatever mechanism it is that's bringing the work to you, it never stops, right? I'll date myself, but we've probably all seen the I Love Lucy episode, right? With Lucy and Ethel in the chocolate factory where the little chocolates run on the conveyor belt and start moving too fast that they can't keep up. And needless to say, that becomes very stressful and it just grinds on you. Our archives are full of letters from wives of workers who wrote to Henry Ford and said, you know, we appreciate this $5 day you're paying now, but my gosh, our husbands really earn it. They come home just absolutely exhausted, sort of wiped out from the day. So that's the whole point of the $5 day. Prior to this, Ford was paying something like $2.35 a day to his workers. A lot of them were getting fed up with the moving assembly line. They were calling in sick. They were simply not showing up. They were quitting. Ford ended up having to replace workers. The turnover rate was several 100% at one point, which, suffice it to say, is not very efficient for the factory. So Ford decides, well, maybe I just need to find the right price for these workers, right? Everybody's willing to tolerate the drudgery of the assembly line if we can pay them enough to do it. And the magic figure turned out to be $5 a day, which was more than twice the rate that people were getting before, and workers lined up by the hundreds for these jobs. And we're showing a photo here just after the policy had been announced, when people were literally kind of swarming the Highland Park plant trying to apply for these jobs. And you know, the whole idea almost worked a little too well for Henry Ford, because not only were people coming from the Detroit area and Southeast Michigan, they were coming from other parts of the country, from the South, from the West, and from the upper Midwest, all descending on Detroit for these jobs. And initially Ford had to kind of put the brakes on the process by adding some conditions. You had to live in Detroit for a certain period of time before you could apply for one of these jobs, and you had to, you know, have a family or prove that you were living the way Ford wanted you to live. In fact, he created his whole service department that basically their job was to kind of get into your business as a worker. They would come to your home or to your apartment. They would inspect it to make sure that you were living the way Henry wanted you to live. You were required to put some of your money away in savings every time you got paid. So really rather onerous things that were being done by the service department, but all in the name, in Henry's mind, of trying to improve workers and kind of elevate the working class into the middle class. And at the end of the day, the $5 day did help to accomplish that. It's what today we would call a living wage. And it's, you know, it's strange, we seem to have regressed over the last 100 years because we're fighting that same fight right now, thinking famously of the fight for $15 minimum wage. So we can think about it having its origins in Henry Ford's $5 day back in 1914. So I'll share a few charts with you here just to give you a sense of the impact of the moving assembly line. This chart just shows production numbers for the Model T from the 1909 to 1927 model year. So its whole 19-year production run. And you see here the numbers climb really pretty markedly even before the moving assembly line. But you look at 1914, then they really start to soar. You see a dip here in 1918, 19. That's caused by World War I. Unlike World War II, the auto industry did not shut down its civilian production during World War I, but nevertheless, they were producing war material. So obviously their production numbers of civilian cars were affected. We see it shoot back up after the war in 1920. Then there's a fall here in 1921. There was a large recession in 1921, partly caused by the kind of buildup and then sudden stop of all the wartime contracts, also caused in some measure by the 1918 flu pandemic. And 100 years later, I think we're kind of reliving history with our current pandemic and the impact that it's had on the economy. Hopefully we won't suffer a recession quite as severe as they did in the early 1920s. But anyhow, the more things change, the more they say the same, it feels. So the numbers climb back up again after that recession until 1923, 1924. Those are the peak years when Ford is turning out 2 million Model Ts a year. And it's true to say that every other car in the United States at that time was a Model T. They made up 50% of the cars on the American road. And that's what makes the Model T so significant. It was affordably priced, and we'll talk about the price here in a moment, but it was the first car that was really within the means of the working class, and that was a quality vehicle, right? It was worth spending your money on. So it was the car that, as we say, put the world on wheels. It did what could only be done once, turning the automobile from a plaything for the wealthy into a tool of everyday life, which for better or for worse, it remains today. But we'll just look at the numbers here, and you notice they plunge dramatically starting in 1925, but especially in 1926, where they really just fall off the cliff. And we'll talk about why those sales fell so quickly. But suffice it to say, the Model T was dealing with some competition it didn't have when it was introduced in 1909 or 1908, I should say. So here's the sort of converse chart to that. This is the price for the Ford Model T. I said we would talk about that in a moment here. You notice when it was introduced, it was priced somewhere around $830. Price shot up to $900 the next year. But then after 1910, the price of the car starts to drop and really pretty much continues to drop in an unbroken line. We're down to about $350 here by 1916, comes back up here during the war, falls again. And the rock bottom price, which you see right here in 1924-25, you could buy a 2-seat Model T runabout for $260. And this is a car that when introduced at that point, almost 10 years ago, it had been more than $800, and now it's down to $260. At the same time, inflation is decreasing the value of the dollar, so it's a really remarkable achievement. The price should fall that far. It's also kind of bad news for Ford Motor Company, because the less the car costs, obviously the less profit they're making on each vehicle. Initially, that wasn't an issue for Ford. He could sell more cars than he could make, so he was making his profits in volume, making very handsome profits, as you all probably know. But by the early 20s now, when the Ford has this new competition, really all Ford can do to move sales is to keep cutting costs. And you can only cut so far, even when you're the size of Ford Motor Company, before it starts to hurt your bottom line. And then while I was in there making charts, I thought I would make one more here. So this is just good for a laugh, but these are your Model T paint options. We talked about this earlier, but you'll notice there were colors available, 4 different colors right up through 1914. And then they went to the all black policy, which lasted until 25, when in part in response to all that competition, Henry brings the colors back. Now you can get your Model T in shades other than black. So just having a little fun with that chart. And I'm showing here the 15 millionth Model T, obviously clearly labeled there on the right. And then on the left is another Model T in the museum's collection. That one is from the 1909 model year, undoubtedly manufactured in 1908. And in fact, one of the first 750 or so Model Ts built, so a very early survivor. And one of the sort of paradoxes of the Model T is that it never changed over its 19-year production run. But yet it did change. Clearly, comparing these two cars side by side, you can tell there's some dramatic changes in the appointments of the car, and the colors, obviously, also in the, frankly, the style. There's a little bit of style in that 1927 model versus the 1909 model, which is very sort of straight, horseless carriage era. But there were no major technical changes. The car's basics, the 4-cylinder engine, good for about 20 horsepower, top speed of about 45 miles an hour, 177 cubic inches. That was the same in 1908 as it was in 1927. The transmission, which was a planetary gear set versus sliding gears like we're used to using today when we drive manual shift cars. The Model T, you shifted with your foot. There was a foot pedal that moved you between high and low gear. And that stayed the same too, right on through the end of the production in 1927. And that wasn't a big issue in 1908, 1909, when most people had never driven a car before. So there wasn't anything they were used to necessarily in terms of a standard for how the control should work. But certainly by the mid-1920s, most other manufacturers were settling on that sliding gear shift, settling on gas pedal, clutch pedal, brake pedal on the floor like we would be used to today. So that becomes a drawback to the Model T by the mid-1920s. Other changes that do get made, as I say, lots of little changes were made. Most of them are just to cut costs in manufacturing, frankly. You notice on the 1908 car, a lot of brass, right? The brass radiator up front, the brass headlamps, the side lamps as well. No brass on the car in 1927. You do have nickel-plated steel here. It was just painted steel for many years, from the mid-teens right on up into the mid-1920s, but that obviously cuts costs. You would have had real leather upholstery and real leather here on your roof in 1908. Artificial leather, needless to say, by 1927. And I mentioned too that sort of concession to style on the 26, 27 Model Ts. The cars actually got a little bit lower, a little rounded here on the front, starting to look a little more designed, if you will, versus just straight horseless carriage. But still, little changes, not major changes. Still underneath the skin there, those two cars are pretty much the same. And needless to say, what was state of the art in 1908 was an antique by the mid-1920s, which was part of Ford's problem. The car was simply outdated in terms of its speed, its performance, and its accessories, which is to say there really weren't many accessories available on the Model T apart from your electric starter, which Ford didn't even introduce until 1919, and then he made you pay extra for that. And this is a good 7 or 8 years after Cadillac had introduced the electric starter on its own cars. And I mentioned competition. The big competition is General Motors. And there were two schools of thought in the automotive industry in the United States in the 1920s. There was Fordism, named, of course, for Henry Ford and Ford Motor Company, which is to say you built one car, you just built a lot of them, and you sold them at a low price and made your profit in volume. Or there was Sloanism, which was named for Alfred Sloan, who was the chairman of General Motors, Ford's chief rival. And Sloanism said you build a series of cars and you develop a sort of a brand hierarchy or a corporate ladder. So somebody who comes into the General Motors family, if they want an entry-level car, a direct competitor to the Model T, they had that in Chevrolet. And then perhaps after a few years, you trade up your Chevrolet for an Oldsmobile, and then perhaps for an Oakland or a Pontiac, which will be launched as a part of the Oakland family soon after this ad was made. And you can work your way up to Buick. And then, of course, at the top of the GM brand ladder was Cadillac, as it remains today. So that was a very different approach to marketing automobiles. And customers were more sophisticated by the 1920s, right? They weren't going to settle for just any car. They wanted options. They wanted colors, for Pete's sake. They wanted more horsepower, and General Motors was more than happy to give it to them. And at the end of the day, even though Ford triumphed in terms of leading sales right on in through the early 1920s, clearly the Sloan approach won out in the end, this idea of marketing multiple cars to multiple different price points. And even Ford adopted that with Ford at their bottom, and then they added Mercury, and then, of course, Lincoln came even before Mercury. And now Ford is just back to the two brands, Ford and Lincoln. But for a long time, Mercury was their mid-level brand. And, of course, they had other brands on and off throughout the years as well. Infamously, Edsel and also Continental for a time in the mid-1950s with its own brand. But in any event, long way of saying that General Motors won out, and Ford's methods weren't going to last forever. The automobile had gone from being a novelty to being a part of everyday life, and people wanted more choice. So all of that said, let us look at the production of the last Model T, the 15 millionth Ford. And we are looking at the Highland Park plant here on May 26, 1927, coincidentally, just a few days after Charles Lindbergh made his famous transatlantic flight. And here we're looking at Charles Sorensen, who was one of Ford Motor Company's earliest employees. He was the head of production by this time, or managing production at the Rouge. And he is taking a small hammer and tapping the serial number into the engine. This is long before VIN numbers, right, or vehicle identification numbers as we know them today. In the 1920s, a car's serial number, for lack of a better term, was the number stamped on the engine. And obviously this is going to be the 15 millionth Ford. So he's going to stamp those numbers. And Sorensen wasn't the only one to stamp numbers that day. In fact, he was joined by Ford's senior most employees at that time, the folks who had been with the company for the longest period of time. And we're looking at all of them gathered here in this picture. And there's some interesting characters here. There's Fred Rockelman, who in the mid-1920s was managing the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railroad for Henry Ford. Henry owned that railroad for a period of time in the 1920s. We have Gus Degner next to him, who was an early racing driver, raced some production cars for Ford later on, helped with production at the Rouge. We have in the glasses here Frank Kulik, another racing driver for Ford Motor Company. In fact, he raced for Ford into the 19-teens. Some people don't realize that Ford had a pretty active racing program into the 19-teens. They were racing for the same reason they race now, right, to generate headlines and generate sales. Ford got out of racing by about 1913, 1914, because frankly, they were selling enough Model Ts that they didn't need the advertising that came with racing. They didn't need the headaches that came with racing. But Kulik's a fascinating character there. Next to him, Charles Mita. Charles Sorensen, who we talked about, co-managed production with P.E. Martin, who is also in the picture over here. Sorensen would go on, probably his greatest contribution to Ford Motor Company was managing Willow Run during World War II, the production of all those B-24 bombers there. We have Charles Hartner here, and then we have John Wandersee, who is in fact Ford employee number one, not counting Henry Ford, I suppose. And he's famously the fellow who became Ford's metallurgist, right? Despite never having any experience or scientific training in metallurgy or understanding how metals work. And that was one of, well, I guess that illustrates two of the quirks about Henry Ford. One, he never really had much use for experts, right? He didn't trust anyone who would show up with a college degree, right? He trusted people who worked with their own hands and had firsthand experience. And he was also a very sharp and keen judge of talent. And he recognized something in John Wandersee, even though he hadn't had any formal training in metallurgy, and thought, this fellow can learn to do it. And indeed he did. Wandersee was quite successful in that position. You might wonder if we know who stamped all those digits, and indeed we do. So here you see exactly the order in which those numbers were stamped, and they were in fact ordered by seniority. So Wandersee gets to stamp the first digit, and Mita being the junior most employee, which not very junior by all standards, but compared to the others, he stamps the last digit. And I have to say, it's fitting that Wandersee stamped the number one. I hope no one was offended by stamping a zero. Certainly not a comment on their worth to the company, but there were a lot of zeros to go around when you're stamping number 15 million. So that's the way it goes, I'm afraid. And here's a shot taken that day, May 26, 1927, of the serial number on the engine. And I'll just zoom it in a little bit so you can see that 15 million right there. And just for fun here, I'm going to cut to a modern picture of the car as it exists in Henry Ford Museum. That is the number as it appears today. And, just as it should be, it's identical. You can see how the 5 kind of drops down a little below the line of the other digits, just as it does today. So proof that we indeed have the 15 millionth car. And I should say here, if you'll forgive just a side note, how is it they decided on 15 million? And obviously it was a nice round number, right, for the last Model T. But people were busy in those days as they were today. So Henry Ford and these senior Ford executives had to pre-schedule the date on which they were going to have this ceremony. In other words, they couldn't just wait around the factory for number 15 million to finally come off the line. So in the days leading up to the determined ceremony date, Ford actually built the 14,999,999th Model T, and then they skipped to build the 15,000,001 Model T. So they kept 15 million aside for the ceremony. So in truth, the 15 millionth car had already been built before they ever had the ceremony. But again, that's how it goes. This is not formally the last ever Model T ever built. It's the ceremonial last Model T. So back to the plant here, we see the engine. They painted a little different color here, so it stands out as it goes along the line here with other engines destined for other Model Ts. Here we see a couple of workers lowering it onto the frame, or what will be the frame of the Model T, the 15 millionth Ford. Here's a shot now of it up on the moving assembly line, or the final assembly line here. And you can see the belts here and the apparatus that drive the car, the chain in the middle that moves it along at a steady rate. And now we've got the controls and the steering wheel installed on the car. The radiator and the grille are there up front, and the fenders as well. front fenders at least. Now the body drop, which is sort of a semi-official final step in building the car, right? And the way the Highland Park assembly line worked, it wasn't like one single line where just parts start on one end and the finished car comes out the other end. Instead, it's a series of different lines. So you've got the chassis moving on the ground floor, you have bodies being assembled up above that, you have engines being assembled somewhere else. And all of these assembly lines kind of merge together into the final assembly where we're seeing the body being dropped on the car. And there it is, just about finished. We see a worker putting whatever the final touches are here on the back of the car as it gets ready to come off the line. And of course, you'd want to drive it off the line for a ceremony like this. So who's going to drive it? Edsel Ford, son of Henry Ford. And there we see Henry himself getting ready to ride in it. And the two of them are going to have this kind of formal ceremony where they take this car off the line. A ceremony that automakers still use today. Anytime there's a significant production milestone, you'll have the head of the company and other senior executives come and drive the car off the line. So nothing new there. Here's another photo. We see Henry looking a little glum in this shot, and then Edsel also looking a little glum as they drive off the line. And this is the photo that always gets reproduced in books and Ford Motor Company histories. And I think a lot of people like to imagine that Henry, was sort of heartbroken, right? All the Model T had done for him, all it had meant to him, and now, quite reluctantly, he had to give up on it, cancel it, and move on to building a new car. But we have other pictures which you'll see where he's smiling. He is happy at this event. So I think this picture kind of paints somewhat of a false picture of his emotional state at this time. I'm sure he was nostalgic and somewhat bittersweet to see the Model T go, but I don't think he was as glum as this photo would suggest. Indeed, here we do see Edsel with a smile on his face and Henry managing a half smile at least. Sorensen and P.E. Martin riding here in the back seat. After the car came off the line, they drove it from the Highland Park plant to the Ford Engineering Lab in Dearborn, which it still exists. It's the building directly behind Henry Ford Museum. You've probably seen it as you drive along Oakwood Boulevard there. And that was always the heart of Ford Motor Company because that's where Henry kept his personal office, even though formally the administration building was still at the Rouge at this point. In fact, they built the Rouge. Henry preferred to be where the engineers were. He always considered himself in that vein. He wasn't a designer. He wasn't certainly an administrator or a manager. He was a gearhead, right? He wanted to be there where the cars are being developed. So naturally, they took it to the engineering lab. And here's a shot of the engineering lab as it appeared circa 1926. And you'll probably recognize Oakwood Boulevard. You hopefully will recognize this building here, Henry Ford Museum, and the Greenfield Village over here with Martha Mary Chapel, the Smith Creek Depot, Menlo Park over in this area. Of course, all still looks the same. What doesn't look the same today is all of this. You'll see the runways here and the letters Ford. This was the old Ford Airport where Henry Ford had built one of the first airports with paved runways and with amenities like a hotel across the street and a waiting room. And this was the factory where they were building Ford Trimotors. Henry exited the aviation business rather abruptly with the onset of the Great Depression. And ultimately, this space became Ford Motor Company Proving Ground, which it still is to this day. And here we are now having arrived at the engineering lab with Henry and Edsel again in the car, posing for some pictures in front of the rather handsome facade in the front of the building. And inevitably, anytime there was some kind of a milestone with Ford Motor Company, or for that matter, personally for Henry Ford, they would pull the quadricycle out of storage. Henry had a fondness for the quadricycle. I mentioned that he sold it to build his second car. He bought it back, I want to say about 1903, 1904. I think he paid like $60 to get it back, which was money well spent for what the car meant to him. But he kept it in his garage at his home in Fairlane, and then they would bring it out for photos, for special events. And certainly you'd want to have the quadricycle there for the 15 millionth Ford. It's where the company started in a sense, so you'd want it there. Now, we kind of teased at this already, but that 15 millionth Ford really, as I say, was the ceremonial last Model T, not officially the final car. And there are a couple of different numbers you'll see for how many Model Ts were built. We have the 15,007,033 cars, which leaves the total number of cars built at the Highland Park plant. But then you'll also see the number 15,458,781, which I think includes cars that were assembled at Ford's regional assembly plants. He had assembly plants throughout the United States for a period of years in all the major cities. All of the main parts were always built and fabricated at Highland Park, but then the kind of sub-assembled pieces would be sent out to these regional plants where the final assembly would be done. But even after they stopped building Model Ts, they had to keep building spare parts for Model Ts, because a lot of these cars would stay on the road for years to come and people would need replacements. So you'll notice that Ford built more than 72,000 engines for Model Ts just in 1928. And they built close to 170,000 engines in total after Model T car production ended. And you might be surprised when Ford built the very last Ford Model T engine. It wasn't until August 4th, 1941. So you're looking at right on the eve of Pearl Harbor. Ford Motor Company is still building spare parts for the Model T. Again, just speaks to how many of those cars were on the road. I mentioned the Rouge briefly, and with the end of the Model T, really the heart and the nexus of Ford Motor Company shifts from Highland Park to the Rouge. Now, Henry had started building the Rouge in 1917 and actually built boats there, submarine chasers intended for World War I. But he starts building Model T parts at the Rouge after the war. Never builds complete Model Ts there, just the parts. The first car built at the Rouge was the car that would replace the Ford Model T. And that car we see right here, the Ford Model A. And Henry was kind of clever here in naming this car. We mentioned the original Model A of 1903 being the very first Ford Motor Company automobile. Well, Ford wanted to emphasize that this new car was so completely new from the ground up that they went back to the original model designation Model A. And the Model A was a hit. It's four-cylinder engine, 40 horsepower, about 200 cubic inches, so more powerful up to the standards of the day. It did have the sliding gear transmission. You didn't have to shift with your feet anymore. And it had some style too, which I think was the Model A's greatest credit. And we have to give Edsel Ford the credit for that. He understood how a car should look, something that Henry never quite could wrap his mind around. So beautiful vehicle. I'm sure Henry had hopes of building Model A's for many years to come. As it turned out, they only built them for 4 model years. You simply couldn't build a car for 20 years unchanged anymore. The industry was changing too quickly. So nevertheless, they managed to build and sell about 5 million Model A's over those 4 model years. So the car was a success by any measure, and still, I think, one of the most handsome vehicles of its era. So let's talk about the 50 million Ford coming out for those production milestones. The backdrop here, obviously the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. This is a photo taken in 1931 for the 20 million Ford. So there are those 5 million Fords I mentioned, and this is a Model A, obviously, but they pulled out the 50 millionth, and then they pulled out the 999, which is one of Henry Ford's early race cars from 1902. And I should say that car exists in the collection of the Henry Ford. Now we're looking at 1934. We're in Chicago at the World Progress exhibition there. And we're looking at Ford's exhibit, and you'll notice a number of significant Ford vehicles here. There's a current model year Ford V8 over here, but then you're also looking at an early Model A over here. You'll see the 20 millionth Ford over here. You'll notice a couple of carriages undoubtedly brought from the Henry Ford Museum, and then the 15 millionth Ford kind of tucked in the middle here. Another shot here from 1934. This is the car as photographed at the museum. You can always recognize that distinct herringbone pattern in our teak floor. Another shot a few years later here in 1939, and this is kind of fun. This is clearly to introduce the new model year Ford here in the front, and kind of driving the point home by having this contrasted with the Model T. And you've got some younger folks here at the wheel of the modern Ford, and then some older folks, some seniors behind the wheel of the Model T, but a fun picture just the same. And here's a shot from 1953, and this is one of those mysteries that we have yet to solve. You'll notice it's the car, no question this is the 50 millionth Ford, but all of a sudden the lettering is gone, and we honestly don't know exactly why or when that disappeared, other than obviously between 39 and 53. But you know, as long as Henry was alive, the Ford Motor Company, the museum, they were all kind of the same thing. So when Ford was putting on some kind of a trade show somewhere, they wouldn't think twice about taking things from the museum. So it wouldn't surprise me if they thought that the car just needed to be brushed up, cleaned up, tidied up for some kind of exhibit somewhere. So they slapped on a new coat of paint and just didn't have time to repaint the lettering. The objects just weren't kind of treated the way we treat them now as artifacts to be kind of cherished and treasured. So it doesn't surprise me, but clearly at some point the car was repainted. So that leads into our conservation efforts we've made with the car, and looking through the notes and our records, frankly, weren't all that good until about the mid-1960s. But From then on, we have a pretty good idea of what we did and when we did it. 1969, we replaced the top. Inevitably, tops wear off on cars like that from opening and closing. And in our museum, we dust the cars a couple of times every week. And believe it or not, over a couple of decades, a feather duster will cause some damage to your top. So it's a fact of life. Likewise, windshield wipers, the rubber just gets brittle and cracked. So one of those was replaced in 1980. We repaired the upholstery on the right side front fenders were refinished in 1986. In 1990, the big change was putting that 15 millionth Ford lettering back on the vehicle where it belongs. I'm so glad we were able to do that. And then in 1998, just as a part of our regular maintenance, we went through and kind of freed the engine. It had seized over time, rotated it to make sure it was moving smoothly, and we do that every few years for most of the cars in the collection. We don't run them on a regular basis, but we want to make sure they're at least the engines will move freely, so we could theoretically run them if we had to or wanted to. The first big exhibit to feature the 15 millionth Model T opened in 1953, which was really the first major exhibit after Henry Ford passed away in 1947. And no surprise, it was an exhibit on the life and times of Henry Ford. So got to have the 15 millionth Model T. It's on display. The desk we're looking at, interestingly enough, is Henry's actual desk from Highland Park. So they sort of recreated his office in one corner, put the car here. And this is the most interesting thing. The space you're looking at is in Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, but it is not a space that the public can currently visit. It's actually located on the second floor of the museum as you walk in our main entrance in the center under that clock tower. And I've got a photo here of the lobby. Those of you who've been to the museum will recognize this. I will admit, I just grabbed this photo off the web. I don't know this couple. I hope they're happy. I hope they had a nice wedding, but it's just a nice wide angle lens to show you. The only way to get up to that second floor is via this staircase. So it leads us to the question, how did they get a Model T up onto the second floor of the museum? And the answer, of course, is very carefully. So here's a shot of the car as it's being lifted on this sort of jury rigged isn't kind enough. I'm sure they were engineers who knew what they were doing, but they've kind of rigged up this temporary crane using the mounting bracket for the chandelier up here and lifted the car up over the railing. So they didn't push it up the stairs. They lifted it up through the center space. And then to get it through the doors into that gallery space, they had to actually turn the car on its side and remove the windshield, obviously, and probably some other parts of the car too, to get it to just squeeze through. But made it in, and I presume they reversed the process when they took the car back down, which they did at some point, because by 1992, the car with the lettering reapplied was on display in our old Automobile in American Life exhibit in what was then called Henry Ford Museum. We see it on display here. Now, if you go to the museum today, more honestly, if you go to Greenfield Village today, I mentioned how you could still see this car on display. And where is it located? It is in the Mack Avenue plant out in Greenfield Village. And as you know, when we redid the village in 2003, 2004, we sort of changed up the interpretation in Mack Avenue. We realized we didn't have any place in the village where we were talking about the Model T and the moving assembly line, and we needed to address those stories out there. So we found an imperfect fit with the Mack Avenue plan. Now, the problem here is they were never doing any moving assembly line work, certainly never building Model Ts at the Mack Avenue plant. So we have to take some artistic license there. But nevertheless, if you go there, obviously the building in the back, you can take a ride in a Model T. You go into the Mack Avenue plant, there's a nice multimedia film presentation about Henry Ford and the moving assembly line. You will also see in there the 15 millionth Ford, and this is how it appears today at the back of that building. So by all means, the next time you're there, make sure to pay a visit to the last Ford Model T. And I wanted to end with one other note. From time to time, we do loan out cars from the museum collection for special events and occasions. We were approached a few years ago by the Historic Vehicle Association. Now they're operated by Haggerty Insurance, but they are like, you've probably heard of the National Register of Historic Places for buildings, where they designate historic buildings and take photos, make blueprints and so forth that get preserved at the Library of Congress. The HVA does this for automobiles. They have a committee that selects 3 or 4 significant automobiles every year, and then they literally take these automobiles out to their headquarters in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and do really deep photography and 3D digital scans of these cars so that they can create records, blueprints of these cars that are then deposited in the Library of Congress. So like buildings are preserved, cars are preserved under this program. And happily, they selected a Model T to go onto that list not too many years ago, and we had to kind of settle on one Model T, and we all kind of agreed, well, why not the last one, the ceremonial 15 millionth Ford, since the first one doesn't exist anymore, and you know, you've got to pick something significant, so why not the last one? And as a part of the ceremonies, they actually took the car out to Washington, D.C. and put it on the National Mall. The HVA has this oversized display case, and each year, I think now they do it in the fall. At this time, it was in the springtime, but they set up the case out there on the mall, load in the car, and they have security there, of course, and they can have the case lit 24 hours a day. So visitors who are on the mall, and locals for that matter in Washington, can just walk up, see this car. And I had the chance to go out there for the 1 week that the Model T was on display. It was a lot of fun to kind of hang out there and overhear people telling stories about the car, or about, you know, the Model T that the neighbor had when they were kids or something like that. So fun to see those stories and those kind of human connections, and also obviously made for a really cool photo. For those of you who've been to Washington, the case is generally located right across from the Air and Space Museum on the mall, so it'll give you a sense of where it's located, but very nice to see it there. So with that, I think I'll stop my sharing here, and we'll open it up to some questions here.
Okay, thanks so much, Matt, for the wonderful presentation. Let me get everyone so that they're unmuted. They can unmute themselves. And now, everyone, you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask any questions. Let's see. Does anyone have any questions? While we're waiting, one thing that occurred to me during the presentation, does the Model T hold the record then, or one of the records for most cars produced, or how, like, who's beat that, or do you have any idea about that? Or
that's a great question. It did hold the record for a long time, but it was finally beat by another car that was kind of cut from the same cloth, a well-built, durable, basic car that was built for a long time. That's the Volkswagen Beetle, right? Which was first sold here in the U.S. in the 1949 model year, and still built in its original form in Mexico, I think, up to 2003. But they built something like 23 million Volkswagen, so it got the Model T by quite a bit. But yeah, that's the current record holder.
Wow, and that was kind of a car that they wanted to be like the Model T in a way, right? Like the people's car or something.
Exactly, yeah. People's car, just cheap, honest transportation, and I say that in an enduring way.
Interesting. Let's see. Does anyone else have any questions that came up?
And I can add, I get asked quite a bit how many cars we have in the museum, and I should have said that at the start. We have about 300 automobiles altogether, and there are maybe 120, 125 out on display in the museum in the village at any one time. So typical of a museum with a large car collection, always sort of more in storage than there is on display. But it's a nice collection. Obviously not all Fords, but a lot of Fords in there.
Wow. Yeah, there's something about that Model T. Have you driven one then?
I have. It's a kind of a scary experience because nothing does what you expect it to do, right? The gas is actually where you think the turn signal would be on a modern car. It's a stalk on the steering wheel, and the gas pedal is in fact the brake pedal on the car. There's a reverse pedal in the middle, and what you'd think would be the clutch is the gear shift. So it takes some getting used to, but it's fun.
Oh, I see a question came in on the chat. Dave asks, how were Ford's finances at the end of Model T's run? Yeah,
they were better at the start of the end than at the end of the end, and I'll explain what I mean here. You know, Ford had only been building Model Ts, right, for 19 years. Every machine he had in Highland Park was specifically designed and built to build Model Ts or Model T parts. So it's not like he could just go in the next day and start building a totally new car. They had to shut down the plant, lay everyone off for 6 months while they worked out the design for the new vehicle, the Model A, and then retool the plant to build that. So suffice it to say that cost a great deal of money, and they had about $0 coming in during that changeover. So fortunately, Ford had a pretty big piggy bank at that point, so they could ride out the storm. But yeah, it was a painful process, and that was a lesson they learned the hard way too. You've got to have flexible mass production so you can make those changes.
Thank you for answering. Thanks for that question. Does anyone else have any other questions before we end the program? Let's see. I don't see anything else coming in. Did you have anything else you wanted to say, Matt, before we end the program? Or
yeah, if you'll permit me, I'll just mention a couple of new exhibits we've got at the museum.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, our Driven to Win Racing in America exhibit presented by General Motors that opened back in March, but we've got more than 30 race cars from all forms of racing in the United States on display right now. We've got simulators there, so you can try your own hand at driving a virtual race car, so you might want to check that out. And then in a couple of weeks, in mid-October, in fact, I think October 22nd is the official opening day for our new exhibit called Collecting Mobility, New Objects, New Stories. We're going to feature a number of vehicles we've collected over the last 10 years, and you'll see some things that haven't been on exhibit before. And we're also going to kind of talk about the process, how it is we decide what to take into the museum collection. And hopefully it'll be kind of interesting, kind of pull back the curtain a little bit on the process.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this evening. This program was brought by Dearborn Public Library and the Henry Ford partnership. And if you want to look up any more information about library programs, you'd visit dearbornlibrary.org. Or if you wanted to look up programs at the Henry Ford, you just go to the Henry Ford site, right?
Absolutely. Yep. We've got all of our programs there at the calendar page.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a good night then. Thanks again, Matt, for doing this excellent presentation. It's a pleasure to watch this presentation and learned a lot from it.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.